And we found that more charity regulations meant fewer charities in a state.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for a new edition of the Perfectus podcast. My name is Gonzalo Schwarz, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Archbridge Institute, the home of Perfectus magazine. This podcast is part of our short series of conversations on the economics of human flourishing. At Archbridge, we define the economics of flourishing as the study of how markets, people, organizations, and institutions support the economic foundations of social mobility and human flourishing. For this episode, I'm delighted to have three great guests with us to discuss social capital in the context of the economics of flourishing. First, we have Dr. Justin Callais, who is our chief economist at the Archbridge Institute, and he's the lead author of our Social Mobility in the 50 States report. He's also an assistant professor of economics at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, and he's a co-editor of our Perfectus magazine. Second, we have Dr. Alicia Plemmons, who is an assistant professor at the Department of General Business at West Virginia University, Director of the Center for Free Enterprise, Director of Healthcare Research and Research Fellow in the NIE Regulatory Center, and she's the co-author of our Institute's policy report on intergenerational mobility, social capital, and economic freedom. And last but certainly not least, we have Elizabeth McGuigan, who is a Senior Vice President at Philanthropy Roundtable. In this role, she oversees the organization's public policy and government affairs team, as well as the philanthropic programs and services team. Elizabeth previously led the policy and government affairs team, working to protect and promote philanthropic freedom by publishing timely research and advancing legislation at the state and federal level. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And I wanted to start off with you, Alicia, and the field of social mobility, or the economics of human flourishing, as we call it, is basically a field about the life cycle of the individual and how they flourish in life, meaning we have to think about all the factors that affect a person's life from different perspectives, both personal and societal. And in this context, why do you think social capital has been found as a very important issue to enable more upward social mobility? How is it social capital related to social mobility in the academic literature as it relates to both the other research and the research that you have conducted? And what are the different kinds of social capital that you've seen in the literature, at least the most recent one?
Sure. So let me first phrase that sort of in what is social mobility and why we're interested in it. So we would like to know if a person or family, can they move up and do better in both the social and economic ladders, right? And this can be income mobility. Are you making more money than your parents or your grandparents? Can it be educational mobility? Do you have new socioeconomic status? And do you have new access to education? It can be occupational mobility, so on and so forth. But many of the papers have really tried to figure out what is the driver of this. So some of that work has been on economic freedom, which we've seen by Justin and Vincent and so many other people that we actually also look at within our study and is really interesting. But another line of literature has been by Raj Chetty, a famous economist that many of us have been watching for a long time. And he calls this idea economic connectedness. So these are his different measures of sort of social capital. And the way that he defines social capital is sort of the extent of friendships or connections in between different groups. So what things are able to bridge and connect you to different groups that you may not have been within the past, whether that be on different socioeconomic status areas, whether that be geographically. And many of these ones that have been very popular in the data set, the different types of measures that he uses, are things that relate to civic engagement. So are people voting? Do they have different types of organizations that they're a part of? What's happening in sort of that local level piece? He also looks at many different things related to like social cohesion, so sort of the thickness of those social ties. Do they have religious pieces behind them? Do they have friendships? Do they have many of these other different types of factors that they were trying to put together? Do they volunteer? Now, a lot of what we work at is thinking both about the social capital aspect, which is important and we've seen is important in the literature, but taking it to that next level, because much of the literature finds institutions to just be a given. Right? They just assume that institutions are there. But what we really know is that good institutions can help build societies and help build prosperous, flourishing societies. So we really wanted to look at the combination in between sort of these social capital measures. We know that your friendships do matter, but it turns out if we don't think about the institutional context, if you don't have good freedoms, if you don't have good institutions, if you don't have good backgrounds for people to be able to engage together, then any amount of friendship isn't going to be able to override that, which was really interesting for us to look at.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much, Alicia. And Justin, I'd like to continue with you and ask if you can briefly go over our social mobility in the 50 states report and discuss what are the areas and indicators that we included in the social capital category of the report.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the social mobility report of the 50 states, we look at kind of the whole life cycle with respect to how the 50 states do with respect to social mobility, considering that it's not just something that matters when you're an adult or a kid, it matters throughout the entire lifespan. And specifically, this is important when it comes to social capital, which is the fourth of, but not the least important by any stretch, of the pillars that we consider in our report. And within that pillar of social capital, we consider two different sort of sub areas. And one of those is community activities and neighbors. So this is something Alicia was alluding to in her answer. And there we look at the percentage of people in the state that attended an event based on the community in the last year. We look at member organizations per 1,000. We look at the percentage of neighbors that do favors for each other in the last did favors for each other in the last month, and also economic connectedness, which is an aspect that Alicia just mentioned from Raj Chetty, which basically looks at how people who are below average income, how often they are friends or connected with people who are above average income. So it's basically a measure of how connected the community is with respect to, despite, income differences. Like, can you still be friends and have connections with people who aren't just in your income bracket? In that second area, we look at charity, which is the percentage of people that made donations of $25 or more in the last year. We look at nonprofit and religious congregations per 1,000 people. We look at the percentage of people that volunteered with the group in the last year. And we consider charity regulations from Philanthropy Roundtable. And so that is basically what we consider in the social capital area. And it really just kind of gets a grasp of the health and well-being of the community in these kind of more informal matters.
Great. Thank you very much, Justin. That's a great segue to my question to you, Elizabeth. One of the main reasons I think we would think about at Archbridge in terms of why social capital matters and why charity on the ground matters is that a lot of the barriers, policy barriers that they are exist for social mobility are just that, policy barriers that can be removed. But a lot of the times it's more personal barriers. It requires helping people on the ground. It's something that either a top-down program or just a policy wouldn't be able to help. And that's the importance that we see in charities helping people one-on-one on the ground is very important. So in that sense, and building on Justin's one of the last indicators that he mentioned, can you please give us an overview of Philanthropy Roundtable's 50-state index of charity regulations that Justin just discussed? What did it measure? What were the main findings in the report, or anything else you want to say about the importance of charities in that context?
Sure. Thank you, Gonzalo. And thanks for having me on today. Really, this topic could not be more timely. So for your listeners who might not be familiar with the Philanthropy Roundtable, I'd like to start just really quick, give some context here. So our vision is to build and sustain a vibrant American philanthropic movement that strengthens our free society. So to achieve that vision, the Roundtable is pursuing a mission to foster excellence in philanthropy, protect philanthropic freedom, to help donors advance liberty, opportunity, and personal responsibility. So with that context, our 50-state index of charity regulations is part of that mission. For this project, we commissioned economist Wayne Weingarten to rank all 50 states on the compliance costs that charities face. And we found that more charity regulations meant fewer charities in a state. In terms of what exactly we looked at, we included a pretty broad set of variables here. We wanted to know, for example, which states impose their sales tax on charities, which states require expensive CPA audits every year, how much it costs to start up a new charity, and what other red tape is wrapped around charities supporting the most vulnerable in our communities. So we found 5 states with the friendliest environment toward charities, where Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, Delaware, and Idaho. And on the flip side, 5 states with the most burdensome environment were Connecticut, Mississippi, New Jersey, Florida, and Pennsylvania. And I just want to note, since we're coming right up against our election here, that this report found that the state charity burdens actually did not break down along red or blue state lines. To offer, for example, Governor DeSantis's Florida is actually among the worst for charities, while Wyoming is among the best. And, President Biden's home state of Delaware is ranked near the top, but its neighbor New Jersey is among the worst. So just wanted to note for your audience too, overregulating charities is really not a partisan issue. But why it's so important is that the vast majority of charities are small, about 90% having less than about $1,000 a year to devote to their endeavors. So every dollar they have to spend meeting regulatory costs is a dollar that isn't going into the communities. So these excessive costs mean fewer resources for your local food bank, fewer students helped by civics programs, more money for the lawyers and accountants, instead of, for example, sheltering those in a housing crisis after a hurricane. So when it comes to building social capital, I think what this report shows is that we would all benefit from lowering the burdens on Americans coming together to meet our challenges.
Yeah, that's great. I completely agree, Elizabeth, with that. And Justin, what are the findings that most surprise you about the category of social capital in our report? And what are some of the results that you would like to highlight? And in that sense, I don't want to go into your own comments, but I think we found something similar to Elizabeth, that some of the better or worse states on social mobility, it's not a partisan issue either.
No, exactly.
Right.
Just like it is for charity regulations, the entire social mobility report is not is pretty bipartisan, right? So you see a lot of states that are a lot more conservative end up towards the bottom, like for example, Florida, Mississippi, West Virginia, Louisiana, and a lot of states that are. But you also see a lot of states that are more traditionally red that end up towards the top, like Utah and the Dakotas. And similarly, you'll find the same for blue states. Specifically with social capital, I think this area is really interesting because it's the area that individuals within the state need to take the most action on. There's not there's obviously some room. For example, charity regulations is a great example of this, but there's not a lot of room for policy that suggest that one can actually take here if you want to more directly sort of increase social capital. There's obviously things you could do with charity regulations that are going to help, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to highlight it. But if you think of a rule that says, oh, you must now, everyone must volunteer an hour of their time at least once a month or once a year or something, isn't gonna really accomplish anything. It's not exactly a realistic rule. But I think when we think about social capital as sort of a community health variable that obviously policy can have at least indirect relationships with, and obviously sometimes direct. One thing I want to mention is specifically the relationship between social capital and out-migration, because over time we've seen that people have become more, geographically mobile in the sense of, moving cost over time as incomes have risen, it's easier to move. It's pretty, it's a burden, right? It's not free to do so, but it is at least. It's a lot less expensive and a lot more doable for people over time than it has been before. So what you're seeing is that people are moving to areas that they want to be a part of, right? They're moving to areas for a variety of different reasons, whether that's the policies of the area, whether that's the weather, whether that's a lot of different factors, right? And policies that are done that basically are put in place that people end up wanting to move from is going to separate community bonds. So one example I'll give is of 5 of the states that have the worst net out migration rate in terms of they have the highest percentage of people leaving that state over the last few years was Mississippi, California, Louisiana, Illinois, and New York. And all of those states are in the bottom 20 or 25, 20 or 15 with respect to social capital. And this suggests something about the fact that as people are moving out, right, they're leaving their communities to try something else. And what's left is the people, you're breaking up communities in that sense, right? And community health is incredibly important, especially on an individual basis, that when people need help or need some sort of community support, Well, a lot of these people have to end up moving because of bad policies in these states because they can't find another way, or they're trying to realize their own American dream and they have to move in order to do so. So I think it's crucially important when we think about, well, you don't want the government putting in a policy that says you must donate money or you must volunteer or you must attend community events. There's a lot of indirect channels in which policies are going to influence these things like social capital. And with the findings themselves, I'll note a few things that I found interesting. Basically gets at the point that there's a huge variance in social capital across these different states. For example, community engagement. So basically, what were the percentage of people that attended an event based on surrounding the community, whether that's a town hall, that could be like a local festival, right? That could be anything regarding anything community related. That ranges from 7%, so less than 1 in 10, to 21%, which is a very drastic difference. Same for neighbors that do favors for one another. In some states, it's basically a quarter of people. In other states, it's over half of the people. That's vast differences in terms of the communities that are being built. And again, communities are incredibly important to help people, especially, in a world where we have a lot of sort of formal welfare support, but it's not individualized, right? It's not, right? The communities, the local areas are the places where those sorts of individual needs are being met. Same for nonprofit organizations and religious congregations. We find that in some states it's less than 3 per 1,000 people. In others it's 10, right? So that's, over triple the amount of nonprofit organizations and religious congregations that people can be a part of in different states. And finally, volunteering, right? So percentage of people that volunteered with a group in the last year. In some states, it's less than 1 in 5. In other states, it's closer to 50%. Again, these are vast differences that have crucially important impacts on societies and communities, and I think they're just important to highlight.
Thank you very much, Justin. And I think maybe this is going to be something somewhat related, Alicia, to what Justin was speaking about in terms of those local policies. Going back to your report and some of your research, how is economic freedom related to social capital? And how do they both sort of affect or interact with each other? And how does that directly impact people in that sense?
Sure. So both are very effective at being able to help society be better, but they really have a multiplicative effect, right? So having very strong connections with your community, having very strong connections with other people, Justin's right. That's not something that you can legislate into existence. It's something that needs to happen organically to be productive for the betterment of people. One other thing to also think about is what is the regulatory environment that they're living in. So when we think about economic freedom, we're starting to think about what is the rule of law? Are there property protections? Are there minimum wages? What are the labor market policies? What's the government spending? What's the tax burden? Because knowing these different pieces and how it affects basically the sandbox that people are able to build in can really grow further beyond what just social connection can do alone, because they really work well in tandem together. So to be able to have human flourishing, you can't just have a disconnected but free society, and you also can't just have a very connected, heavily involved society with so much regulations that it's impossible to be able to do anything, like the charity regulations that we had mentioned earlier. The best way to be able to multiply together towards having a more prosperous future is having both social connections and an institutional basis of economic freedom that makes it possible to be able to organically build these connections and be able to be successful with businesses or charities or whatever else it will be.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alicia. And Elizabeth, going back to and speaking about building social capital on the ground in these communities, in the work that you do in the Philanthropy Roundtable, you're interacting both with different charities across the United States and also donors as well. So how do you think these charities enhance social capital in their communities? Do you have any very specific examples or groups that you know of? And what is the role that philanthropists play in enhancing that social capital? Sometimes more than just providing the fund, just sometimes leading by example, and if you have any stories about that or any examples.
That's right. Yeah, I have a ton of examples. I'd love to share some. Just a quick sidebar on what Alicia and Justin just spoke about as well. I want to stress that economic freedom is also what makes philanthropy possible to begin with. And the roundtable is going to be releasing new research on that front in the coming year.
Excellent.
So, sidebar, completely agree with the importance of economic freedom in fueling all of what we're talking about today. But back to your question. So local charities rooted in values play a pivotal role in enhancing social capital because they're empowering individuals and they're helping strengthen those community ties. So philanthropy is the engine behind this and is the embodiment of really what we're trying to build through social capital. I mean, we could look at just this month so far and the daunting challenges that are facing people in Western North Carolina and Florida. They're facing a long road to recovery. And in disaster relief, there are organizations like Samaritan's Purse, is one of the examples. They're helping strengthen social capital and volunteerism by mobilizing local citizens to help each other in their own communities. And as the other panelists have said, this isn't about government policies. This is about people coming together to make a difference in their community. And we see this direct service as fostering that shared sense of purpose, values, community responsibility. But most importantly, individuals are empowered to rebuild their communities from within. And outside of such disasters, which obviously provide unfortunate, ample evidence for this, I'd also point to education groups like Success Academy charter schools in New York City that are cultivating social capital by providing character-driven education. These groups are on the front lines of promoting civic engagement, critical thinking, and preparing students to become responsible citizens and to become themselves social capital accelerators. To the second part of your question, so philanthropists drive and fuel these efforts for sure by funding these programs. They're amplifying local initiatives. They're fostering immediate relief and long-term community development. But the key point that I want to make here is that it really is generous Americans, givers of all sizes, that are advancing individual liberty and empowering the local communities to take ownership. They're promoting a culture of volunteerism, personal responsibility, and mutual support that helps build stronger, more connected societies. So that's really how critical philanthropy is for building social capital. Like I said, economic freedom is what makes this philanthropy possible. So, really important question.
Yeah, and just to quickly follow up on that, Elizabeth, do you see like a disincentive sometimes for philanthropists if there are more public funds that go into some of these communities in the sense that they might be crowding out private philanthropy or influencing the work of these charities on the ground, that maybe they just seek out more of those government funds and then they can't, or they have issues with that later on in terms of getting money from private philanthropies or just scaling that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I don't know necessarily that government funding becomes a disincentive for philanthropists, but I think that the problem here is certainly there is some crowding out of funding. But I think the bigger problem is twofold, right? So you have government literal strings, different regulations that charities have to meet by because they're taking the government money, and that does a disservice to charities. We have some research that our research director, Jack Hammond, is working on right now. Just sent me a chart and an email a few days ago about this. But more government funding for charities appears to be associated with charities using more funds for overhead expenses. So we know, obviously, there are important administrative expenses that should be funded so a charity can actually be effective. But it's an interesting factor and certainly something for open right for more research if you're going to have more overhead expense costs when you're getting more government funding. So I think that's interesting. Look, if the government is involved, you might see more money actually diverted from the on-the-ground initiatives, and that can be problematic. But I think overall, as long as we're protecting donors' rights and freedoms to give and volunteer how and where they choose, that's what's really going to help the charitable sector thrive and remain vibrant in the way that we need right now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And just maybe Justin to close us off, or both Justin and Alicia, based on the policy brief that you did for Archbridge linking economic freedom, economic mobility, and social capital, was we are obviously all discussing how social capital is extremely important. But in that research, did you find that one of them, they were both complementary, but whether one of them was maybe more important than the other in terms of economic freedom, promoting upper mobility or social capital? Are there any other findings from that research that you want to highlight?
So yeah, I'll start with specifically. It matters the type of social capital that really mattered for mobility. So there was the bonding. There's sort of a bonding measure and then a bridging measure. So a bonding measure seems to hurt mobility because in the sense that it means that people who are already alike are able to kind of collectively organize and lobby for special interests. And well, that's beneficial for them, right? That's worse off for everyone else in terms of they're getting these lobbying expenditures. However, bridging social capital, the idea that basically people are more connected and more engaged with each other, and it's more of a widespread participation rather than a sort of like narrow special interest group perspective. That seems to matter a lot for mobility. The sort of bridging kind of widespread community involvement, engagement, and connectedness that we have with one another. What we do find is that they're complementary, right? In the sense that this sort of bridging social capital as well as economic freedom are complementary. You can have, there ends up actually being, interestingly, essentially no relationship between economic freedom and economic connectedness that Ross-Chetty, the measure that Ross-Chetty came out with. And so we basically find that as evidence that, well, if both of these things matter for mobility, but they're not related really to each other at all, we can then have both, right? Ideally, you just have both of them and you get even higher levels of intergenerational mobility.
And then I do want to add on one piece to that as well. Within that study, one of the things that we also noticed is economic freedom is great at being able to help build this intergenerational mobility, especially in conjunction with this economic connectedness. But some parts of economic freedom were a little bit more impactful to others. For example, reductions in labor market regulations tended to have very large growth potential for this intergenerational mobility. Some of that might be related to occupational perspectives, like they're able to move into more professional fields or they're able to get into jobs that they need to get into. I can't do a podcast without mentioning licensing at least once. That's one of those things that are very important to be able to look at because it creates barriers for individuals to go forward. So while looking at all parts of economic freedom is important, that is one interesting piece that we did find was that labor market regulations and reductions in labor market regulations allowed for more prosperous undertakings.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alicia. Well, I just wanted to thank everyone for this great conversation. It really showed how social capital in so many ways was one of the big pillars and the backbone in some ways for more social mobility across the United States. And I encourage everyone to visit the research of Philanthropy Roundtable, the work Philanthropy Roundtable, Alicia's work on social capital, but also on occupational licensing. Alicia didn't want to not mention that. And obviously Justin and I and the work that we're doing at the Archbridge Institute. But I think we're all trying in some way to increase social capital and even economic freedom in our work. So those are important building blocks. And I hope we enjoy the conversation today with these three great speakers. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Perfectus podcast. It's been a pleasure to dive into the fascinating world of the economics of human flourishing with our esteemed guests. As we continue this series, we look forward to exploring more about how markets and institutions not only support, but also enhance our social mobility and overall well-being. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform so you don't miss an episode. And for more insights, be sure to visit us at the Archbridge Institute and check out Perfectus magazine. We're excited to bring you more conversations that bridge the gap between economics and the pursuit of human flourishing. Thank you once again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.